The ballroom of Ashton House blazed with 1,000 candles, their collective light catching on crystal chandeliers and casting dancing shadows across the faces of London's finest society, gathered on this crisp October evening in the year 1827. The air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility, swirling silk gowns in jewel tones, the rich scent of hothouse roses despite autumn's chill outside, the mingled perfumes of bergamot and lavender, the subtle musk of pomade and ambition. Laughter rippled through the crowd like water over stones, punctuated by the bright notes of violins tuning, preparing for the next dance. Among this sea of eager faces and hopeful hearts stood Eleanor Hartwell, a figure of such studied composure that she might have been carved from marble, beautiful and untouchable, her dark hair arranged in an elegant style that exposed the pale column of her throat, her gown of midnight blue silk fitting her slender frame with a perfection that spoke of London's finest modiste. She was, by all accounts, a vision, yet there was something in her dark eyes, something carefully controlled, that suggested she saw nothing of the beauty surrounding her, felt nothing of the excitement that electrified the room. Asterisk, I am stone. Asterisk, she thought, the words a familiar refrain that had sustained her through countless evenings such as this. Asterisk, I am ice. I cannot be touched, cannot be wounded, cannot feel. Asterisk, 3 years had passed since the world as she knew it had shattered, since the man she loved, Thomas Sinclair, with his warm laugh and gentle hands, had married Catherine Ashford, her dearest friend, the one person she had trusted with every secret save one. 3 years since Eleanor had stood in a garden while her heart broke so thoroughly she had thought she might die of it, yet had found herself still breathing, still existing in this world that suddenly held no joy. She had transformed herself in those years, deliberately, carefully, building walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them. Now, at 24, she moved through society with practiced grace, accepted dances with appropriate gentlemen, smiled at appropriate moments, and felt absolutely nothing at all. It was safer this way, infinitely safer. Yet across the crowded ballroom, standing in shadow near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, a man watched her with an intensity that would have unsettled her had she noticed. Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, had been observing Eleanor Hartwell for weeks now, studying the precise way she held herself apart, the careful emptiness in her expression, the way she seemed to exist behind glass. He recognized that particular form of self-protection. He understood it intimately, and for reasons he could not entirely explain, even to himself, he found he could not look away. The musicians struck the opening notes of a waltz, and Eleanor felt the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way partners began seeking each other out, the dance floor clearing in anticipation. She had positioned herself near Lady Pemberton, a woman of advanced years whose conversation, though tedious, provided excellent camouflage against unwanted attention. Yet even as Eleanor arranged her features into an expression of polite interest in Lady Pemberton's discourse on the declining quality of modern rose cultivation, she felt a presence approaching, something that made the air itself seem to change. When the voice came from behind her left shoulder, it was deep and measured, carrying the kind of authority that required no elevation in volume. "Miss Hartwell, I believe you have promised me this dance." She turned, knowing before she completed the movement that she had promised no such thing, and found herself looking up into the face of Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth. He was tall, she noticed first, with dark hair that held no concession to the popular styles, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, and eyes of such a peculiar shade, grey with hints of blue, like a winter sky before snow, that she felt momentarily disoriented. His features were strong, almost severe, with a mouth that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it even less often. There was something almost unsettling in his directness, the way he looked at her as though the crowded ballroom had disappeared entirely, as though they two stood alone in some vast, empty space. "Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, betraying nothing of her annoyance at his presumption. "I fear you are mistaken. My card is quite full this evening." It was a lie, transparent to anyone who cared to notice, but society's rules provided for such polite fictions. He did not smile, but something shifted in his expression, a subtle acknowledgement that he knew precisely what she was doing. "Then I must beg you to make an exception," he said, extending his hand with such certainty that refusal would appear churlish, would draw exactly the kind of attention she spent considerable energy avoiding. Around them, she could feel the weight of watching eyes, hear the whispers beginning like wind through dry leaves, the Duke of Ashworth actually speaking to someone, actually requesting a dance, he who had barely attended a society function in 2 years, who maintained his vast estates and his considerable fortune from a position of splendid isolation, who was rumored to have once been engaged but had retreated from society after some mysterious disgrace or heartbreak that no one could quite specify but everyone claimed to know about. Eleanor felt trapped, cornered by propriety and public scrutiny. With the smallest inclination of her head, she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. His hand settled at her waist with perfect correctness, yet she felt the warmth of it even through the layers of silk and corsetry, felt an unwelcome awareness of his proximity as they began to move. He danced well, she noted with reluctant approval, with the kind of unconscious grace that spoke of excellent instruction, thoroughly internalized. Yet there was something in the way he held her, a kind of careful attention that made her profoundly uncomfortable. Asterisk. He sees too much. Asterisk, she thought, keeping her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder, refusing to meet those unsettling grey eyes. Asterisk, I must give him nothing, reveal nothing, be nothing but polite indifference. Asterisk, you dance beautifully, Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the swelling music, though I suspect you would prefer to be anywhere but here. The observation, uncomfortably accurate, pierced through her carefully maintained composure like a blade finding the gap in armor, and Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced in 3 years, the dangerous, treacherous possibility that someone might actually see her. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1824, Eleanor Hartwell had been an entirely different creature, 21 years old, with eyes that held light instead of carefully constructed emptiness, a laugh that came easily and without calculation, a heart that beat with the particular intensity known only to those who have not yet learned that hope can be a dangerous thing. She had been in love with Thomas Sinclair for as long as she could remember, having thoughts beyond childhood games, though she had never spoken the words aloud, never dared to give voice to the feeling that consumed her whenever he entered a room, whenever his hand brushed hers in passing, whenever he smiled at her with that gentle, familiar warmth that she interpreted times foolishly, so foolishly times as evidence of reciprocated affection. Thomas had been her companion since earliest memory. The boy who lived at the neighboring estate, whose family and hers had been entwined through generations of friendship and proximity, who had pulled her from a pond when she was 8 and had fallen through thin ice, who had taught her to ride properly when her own father had not the patience, who had been present at every significant moment of her young life, like a golden thread woven through the fabric of her existence. They had been inseparable, or so she had believed, attending the same assemblies and house parties, reading the same books and debating their merits with the kind of passionate intensity that Eleanor had convinced herself meant something profound, something that would inevitably, naturally, transform into an acknowledged attachment, a courtship, a marriage that would surprise no one because it seemed as inevitable as spring following winter. And then there was Catherine Ashford, beautiful, vivacious Catherine, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer sky, whose laughter was infectious, whose kindness was genuine and unstudied, who had become Eleanor's dearest friend during their shared season, who completed their trio with such natural ease that Eleanor had welcomed her presence without reservation, without the slightest suspicion that she was inviting in the instrument of her own destruction. They had been golden together, those three, spending long afternoons in gardens and drawing rooms, attending balls and musicales as a united presence, and Eleanor had been so secure in her unspoken understanding with Thomas, so certain of the trajectory of her life, and that she had failed to notice the small details that should have warned her. The way Thomas's gaze lingered on Catherine when he thought no one observed, the way his voice softened when he addressed her, the way he positioned himself always where he might see her, the way his attention, which Eleanor had believed focused on herself, had actually shifted to Catherine with a completeness that left Eleanor suddenly, terrifyingly invisible. She had been blind, willfully and completely blind, seeing only what she wished to see, interpreting every smile and every kindness through the lens of her own desperate hope, until the evening, when reality shattered her carefully constructed fantasy with the brutal efficiency of a hammer striking glass. The announcement came on a Thursday evening in late April at the Ashford family's townhouse during what was meant to be an intimate gathering of close friends, though Eleanor would later reflect that there was nothing intimate about the moment her entire world collapsed. They had been assembled in the drawing room, perhaps 20 people in total, engaged in that pleasant post-dinner conversation that always felt warm and slightly indulgent, when Thomas had risen from his seat with a particular expression on his face, nervousness mixed with joy, anticipation barely contained, and Eleanor had felt the first whisper of unease, a coldness that began at the base of her spine and spread upward like frost creeping across a window pane. She had been sitting beside Catherine on the settee, their friendship so easy and natural that Eleanor had thought nothing of Catherine's unusual quietness that evening, had attributed the high color in her friend's cheeks to the warmth of the room, had noticed nothing amiss until Thomas began to speak. The savor nodding, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that fell as people recognized an announcement was forthcoming. "My dear friends," he had said, and even then, even in that moment, Eleanor had not understood, had not allowed herself to understand. "I have the great honor and happiness to share with you the most joyful news of my life. Miss Catherine Ashford has agreed to become my wife." The words had landed like physical blows, each one striking with precision against Eleanor's unprotected heart, and she had felt the world tilt sickeningly, felt the floor become uncertain beneath her feet, felt the air itself become too thick to breathe. Around her, the room erupted in exclamations of delight and surprise, voices overlapping in congratulations and expressions of happiness, and through it all Eleanor sat frozen, her face arranged in what she desperately hoped resembled appropriate pleasure, while inside her something fundamental was shattering, breaking apart with a violence that seemed impossible to conceal. Catherine had turned to her immediately, taking Eleanor's hand with genuine affection, her eyes bright with happiness and perhaps a touch of anxiety, saying, "Oh, Eleanor, I so hoped you would be pleased. You are my dearest friend, and your approval means everything to me." And Eleanor had heard her own voice responding as though from a great distance, "Of course, Catherine, I am so very happy for you both." The lies forming with a fluency that would later terrify her, the performance beginning in that instant of absolute devastation. She had watched Thomas cross the room to stand beside Catherine, had seen him take her hand with a tenderness that Eleanor had dreamed would one day be directed toward herself, had observed the way he looked at Catherine with love, with unmistakable, genuine, complete love, and had understood with brutal clarity that whatever she had believed existed between herself and Thomas had been entirely, pathetically, one-sided. The evening had continued with its terrible momentum, champagne produced, toasts offered, wedding plans discussed with enthusiasm by mothers and sisters, and through it all Eleanor had maintained her composure with a discipline she had not known she possessed, smiling until her face ached, offering congratulations until the words became meaningless sounds, existing in a state of numb disconnection that was the only thing standing between her and complete collapse. When she could finally escape, claiming fatigue with what she hoped was convincing casualness, she had walked with measured steps through the townhouse to the garden doors and had slipped outside into the cool spring night, and only then, alone beneath stars that seemed mockingly indifferent to her pain, had she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened, standing among the roses as her carefully constructed future dissolved like morning mist, as every hope and dream and assumption crumbled to dust, as she realized that she must somehow find a way to hide this agony, to preserve both Thomas's friendship and Catherine's, to attend their wedding and smile and pretend that her heart was not breaking, that her life was not ending, that she had not just lost everything that mattered. The wedding took place on a luminous June morning, all golden sunlight and blooming roses, the kind of day that seemed deliberately, cruelly designed to mock Eleanor's interior darkness as she stood among the assembled guests in the village church and watched Thomas Sinclair pledge his eternal devotion to Catherine Ashford with a sincerity that was evident in every word, every glance, every tender gesture. Eleanor had positioned herself carefully, not too close to the front where her expression might be scrutinized, not so far back that her absence from a prominent position would be remarked upon, and she had worn pale blue because white would have been inappropriate, and anything darker would have suggested mourning, which would have invited questions she could never answer. Throughout the ceremony, she maintained the performance that had become her constant companion since that terrible April evening. Her face arranged in an expression of gentle pleasure, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though beneath her gloves, her nails pressed crescents into her palms with enough force to leave marks that would last for days. Her breathing carefully measured, because if she allowed it to become irregular, she feared she might shatter entirely, might cry out or collapse or do something that would expose the magnitude of her agony to everyone present. When Thomas lifted Catherine's veil and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of genuine love, Eleanor felt something inside herself break irreparably, some final fragile thing that had been holding her together, and she understood in that moment that she would never be the same person she had been before, that the girl who had loved so hopefully and completely had died in this church beneath the weight of watching her dreams given to someone else. The wedding breakfast that followed was an exercise in exquisite torture, hours of forced gaiety and champagne toasts and wedding cake that tasted like ashes in Eleanor's mouth, of watching Thomas and Catherine glow with happiness, while she smiled until her face felt like a mask that might crack and fall away to reveal the devastation beneath. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor withdrew from society with a completeness that alarmed her family, claiming fatigue, headaches, a general malaise that kept her confined to the house, while Catherine and Thomas departed for their wedding journey, and the world continued its rotation as though nothing of consequence had occurred, as though Eleanor's entire existence had not been fundamentally altered. Her mother came to her room one evening, as autumn's first chill crept through the air, sat beside Eleanor's bed where she lay staring at nothing, and said with characteristic gentleness, "My darling girl, I understand your heart is broken, and I will not pretend that such pain heals quickly or easily, but you cannot remain in this darkness forever." And Eleanor had responded with a clarity that surprised them both, "I will return to society, Mama, but I will never allow myself to be so vulnerable again. I will never give anyone the power to hurt me as I have been hurt." And she had kept that promise, spending the following months transforming herself from the open, hopeful girl she had been into someone harder, more polished, impenetrable, constructing walls around her heart with such determination that when she finally returned to ballrooms and drawing rooms that winter, she was met with admiration for her beauty and poise, with increased attention from suitors who found her new reserve intriguing, but no one seemed to notice or care that something essential had been lost, that the warmth that had once animated her features had been replaced by a cold perfection that resembled life but was merely its carefully constructed imitation. The morning arrived with that particular quality of light that follows sleepless nights, pale and somehow accusatory, filtering through Eleanor's bedroom curtains as she lay in bed contemplating the previous evening's encounter with the Duke of Ashworth, his dark eyes that had seemed to perceive too much, his persistence that had unsettled her, carefully maintained equilibrium in ways she was not prepared to examine. She descended to the breakfast room later than usual, discovering her mother already seated with her correspondence, and her younger sister Beatrice, practically vibrating with excitement over her toast and chocolate, the girl's 19-year-old enthusiasm for romance, as yet untarnished by disappointment or loss, and Eleanor felt simultaneously protective of that innocence and exhausted by its naivete. "Eleanor," Beatrice exclaimed the moment she entered, propriety abandoned in her eagerness, "everyone is speaking of the Duke's attention to you last evening. Lady Pemberton told Mama that he barely looked at another woman the entire night, that he positioned himself specifically to observe you, and when you danced together, Charlotte Morrison said it was the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. The way he looked at you, as though you were the only person in the entire ballroom." Eleanor poured herself tea with studied calmness, adding precisely the amount of milk she preferred, while formulating a response that would discourage this line of speculation without revealing how thoroughly the Duke's attention had disturbed her, saying finally with deliberate lightness, "Charlotte Morrison is prone to romantic exaggeration, as we all know, and the Duke was merely being polite, fulfilling his social obligations as any gentleman would." Her mother looked up from her letters with that particular expression that suggested she perceived far more than Eleanor wished her to see, observing quietly, "The Duke of Ashworth has not attended a London social event in nearly 4 years. Eleanor, His presence at Lady Hartington's ball was remarkable in itself, but his marked attention to you was quite beyond mere politeness, and I think you know that perfectly well." Eleanor felt a flash of irritation at her mother's perceptiveness, at this intrusion into the carefully controlled interior life she had constructed. But before she could formulate a sufficiently dismissive response, Beatrice continued with her characteristic enthusiasm. "I think it is wonderfully romantic, a duke emerging from mysterious seclusion to pursue you. It is like something from a novel, and he is so handsome in that dark, brooding manner, and terribly wealthy, of course. And you would be a duchess, Eleanor. Can you imagine?" "I can imagine," Eleanor said with more sharpness than she intended. "That speculation of this nature is both premature and unwelcome, and I would appreciate if we could discuss something other than the Duke's supposed interest in me." The words created a small, uncomfortable silence, Beatrice's face falling in hurt confusion, while their mother's expression shifted to concern. And Eleanor immediately regretted her tone but could not seem to soften it, trapped in the defensive patterns that had become her default response to anything that threatened her emotional armor. It was in this tense moment that the butler entered carrying the morning's second post on a silver tray, presenting it to Eleanor's mother, who sorted through the various letters and invitations before pausing over one particular envelope, her face registering surprise and something more complex, something that made Eleanor's chest tighten with premonition even before her mother spoke, saying carefully, "We have received a letter from Catherine Sinclair. She and Thomas are returning to London after 3 years in Derbyshire. They will arrive next week and hope to call upon us at our earliest convenience." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup, the delicate porcelain rattling against the saucer in a way that surely betrayed her agitation, though she fought to keep her expression neutral and to appear merely politely interested rather than devastated by this news that meant the past she had worked so hard to bury would soon be standing in her drawing room, unavoidable and undeniable, forcing her to confront everything she had spent 3 years trying to forget. The Duke of Ashworth arrived at the Hartwell residence precisely 3 days after the ball, and his timing so impeccable that Eleanor could not help but suspect he possessed some preternatural awareness of when she would be most unsettled, most vulnerable to disruption, and indeed, she had spent those intervening days in a state of agitation she refused to acknowledge, caught between the disturbing news of Thomas and Catherine's imminent return and the equally disturbing memory of the Duke's dark eyes, watching her with that peculiar intensity that suggested he saw far more than she wished to reveal. She was in the morning room attempting to focus on correspondence when the butler announced the Duke's arrival, and something in her chest tightened with an emotion she could not name, would not name, as she rose to receive him in the formal drawing room, where her mother had already positioned herself with her embroidery, as propriety demanded. The Duke entered with that same commanding presence she remembered, tall and dark and utterly self-possessed, bowing to her mother with perfect courtesy before turning those perceptive eyes upon Eleanor, and she felt suddenly exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the modest neckline of her morning dress, and everything to do with the sense that he could perceive the chaos beneath her carefully maintained exterior. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying that same quality of directness that eschewed the usual social pleasantries, "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time, but I wish to request the pleasure of your company for a drive through Hyde Park this afternoon, if you are amenable, and your mother grants permission." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, and to manufacture some excuse that would maintain the distance she preferred, but her mother spoke before she could formulate her decline, saying with warmth that felt almost like betrayal, "How thoughtful of you. Your Grace, I am certain Eleanor would be delighted. The weather is particularly fine today, and she has been spending far too much time indoors lately." There was no graceful way to contradict her mother's assertion without appearing deliberately rude, and so Eleanor found herself agreeing with as much composure as she could muster, and 2 hours later she was seated beside the Duke in his elegant curricle, as he guided his perfectly matched greys through the fashionable paths of Hyde Park, where all of London society came to see and be seen. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees in patterns that shifted across his strong features as he drove with easy competence, and after the initial pleasantries had been exhausted, he turned to her with unexpected directness and asked, "What do you read, Miss Hartwell?" I am curious about what occupies your mind when you are not enduring tedious social obligations. And the question was so different from the usual inane conversation that she found herself momentarily disarmed, answering with more honesty than she intended. Poetry, primarily, and philosophy. When I wish to feel intellectually challenged, though I suspect you find that an odd combination for a young woman. His response came without hesitation, without the patronizing surprise most men exhibited when she mentioned philosophical interests, saying simply, "On the contrary, I find it entirely consistent with what I have observed of you. You possess a contemplative nature beneath your social performance. Do you not, Miss Hartwell?" The question, gentle yet penetrating, struck too close to truths she guarded carefully, and Eleanor felt her defenses rising like a wall. But when she turned to deliver some deflecting response, she found him watching her with an expression of understanding rather than curiosity, as though he recognized the armor she wore because he wore similar protection himself. And in that moment, she realized with uncomfortable clarity that the Duke of Ashworth was far more dangerous to her peace than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Weeks passed with a relentlessness that Eleanor found increasingly difficult to ignore, each social engagement bringing the inevitable appearance of the Duke of Ashworth with a predictability that should have been tiresome, but instead created a peculiar tension in her chest that she refused to examine too closely, a tightening of anticipation that felt dangerously close to expectation. He materialized at every ball, every soirée, every dinner party she attended, always requesting the first dance with that quiet insistence that made refusal seem churlish, always positioning himself beside her at table when the social architecture allowed, always watching her with those dark, perceptive eyes that seemed to catalogue every flicker of emotion she tried to conceal behind her carefully maintained composure. Society's speculation grew like hothouse flowers, conversations pausing when she entered rooms, fans fluttering with whispered commentary about the Duke's unprecedented courtship, about Eleanor's apparent indifference to an honor that would have sent other young women into transports of delight, and she felt both irritated by the attention and unsettled by something deeper, a curiosity she could not entirely suppress about what motivated his persistence, what he saw when he looked at her that warranted such sustained effort. The evening of Lady Melbourne's musicale arrived, wrapped in the soft melancholy of early autumn, and Eleanor found herself seated beside the Duke, in the third row of gilt chairs arranged for the performance, the proximity forcing an intimacy that felt both uncomfortable and oddly natural as a soprano began a heartbreaking aria about lost love that seemed specifically designed to strip away emotional defenses. "Music affects you," the Duke observed quietly during the polite applause between pieces. Not a question, but a statement of perceived truth. And Eleanor felt that familiar defensiveness rising until she looked at his face and saw not curiosity but recognition, as though he understood what it meant to be moved by beauty while simultaneously resenting that vulnerability. "I find it difficult," she admitted with unusual honesty, surprising herself, "to maintain proper composure when confronted with genuine artistry. It feels like an intrusion somehow, the way it reaches past one's carefully constructed boundaries." He was silent for a moment, his profile illuminated by candlelight as the next performer prepared, and then he said with quiet intensity, "I was engaged once, 4 years ago, to a woman I believed loved me for myself rather than my title and fortune. I was young enough to trust that such distinction mattered, fool enough to ignore the signs that her affection was performance rather than truth." Eleanor turned to him in surprise, seeing something raw and unguarded in his expression that made her chest ache with unwilling sympathy. And he continued, "She accepted my proposal with apparent joy, planned our wedding with enthusiasm, and 1 month before we were to marry, I discovered her in the gardens with her true love, a man without title or fortune. Hearing her explain that she would marry me for security while maintaining him as her lover, that dukes were useful but rarely lovable. The words hung between them like something tangible, a shared understanding of betrayal and the walls one built afterward, and Eleanor felt her own defenses cracking in ways that terrified her, even as she recognized the gift of his vulnerability, the courage it required to expose old wounds to someone who might use them carelessly. But before she could formulate a response that matched his honesty, she felt panic rising, that old familiar terror of connection, and she turned her attention firmly back to the performance, rebuilding her walls with desperate efficiency while feeling his quiet disappointment like a weight against her heart. The garden party at Lady Pemberton's estate unfolded beneath a sky of uncertain temperament, autumn clouds gathering with the promise of rain that matched the turbulence in Eleanor's chest as she moved through the manicured grounds with studied grace, her pale green dress whispering against the grass while she maintained careful conversation with acquaintances whose names barely registered in her consciousness, because every particle of her awareness was consumed by the knowledge that Thomas and Catherine had returned to London and would certainly attend this gathering. It was inevitable, inescapable, the confrontation she had both dreaded and somehow perversely anticipated during the long weeks since learning of their return. She saw Catherine first, standing beside the rose arbor in a dress of soft yellow that complemented her golden beauty, and Eleanor's breath caught with the same painful complexity of emotion she had carried for 3 years, that terrible mixture of love and loss and resentment toward someone who had committed no sin except being loved by the man Eleanor herself had wanted. And then Thomas appeared at Catherine's side, and Eleanor felt time collapse, felt herself simultaneously 21 and heartbroken and 24 and armored, watching him with the strange doubled vision of memory and present reality as Catherine's eyes found hers across the garden and lit with genuine joy that made Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses feel suddenly cruel and small. Catherine moved toward her with obvious eagerness, Thomas following more reluctantly, and then they stood before her in a tableau that felt both momentous and terribly ordinary, Catherine reaching for Eleanor's hands with warmth that seemed unconscious of the 3-year silence between them, saying with feeling that carried no artifice, "Eleanor, dearest Eleanor, how I have missed you, how beautiful you look, how I have hoped for this moment, to speak with you again, to understand why you withdrew from us so completely after the wedding. Did I do something to offend you? Please tell me so I might make amends." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, Catherine's innocent confusion about the distance Eleanor had imposed, cutting deeper than anger ever could, and she found herself murmuring something about being occupied with family matters, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue as Thomas stood silent and watchful, his blue eyes carrying a knowledge that Catherine's did not, some male awareness of unspoken feeling that made Eleanor wonder with hot shame if he had always known, had always perceived her foolish devotion and chosen to ignore it out of mercy or discomfort. She felt herself drowning in the awkwardness, in Catherine's earnest questions and Thomas's guilty silence, felt the old wound tearing open despite the scar tissue she had so carefully cultivated, and then suddenly the Duke of Ashworth was beside her, materializing with that uncanny awareness he seemed to possess of precisely when she needed rescue, his tall presence solid and grounding, as he greeted Thomas and Catherine with perfect courtesy, while somehow managing to position himself slightly between Eleanor and them, a subtle shift of geography that felt protective, possessive, deliberately claiming. Something passed between the Duke and Thomas in that moment, some wordless masculine communication that Eleanor could not decipher but felt in the sudden tension of Thomas's shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed fractionally as he assessed this man who stood so close to Eleanor with such obvious intention, and she found herself confused by her own reaction, by the relief she felt at the Duke's intervention, mixed with irritation at being treated as something requiring protection, by the strange comfort of his presence, even as she resented her dependence upon it, and beneath all of it, a deeper confusion about which pain cut more sharply now, the old ache of seeing Thomas, or the new fear of what the Duke's steady courtship was awakening in her carefully deadened heart. Eleanor's bedchamber felt simultaneously like sanctuary and prison as she dismissed her maid with trembling hands, and finally, mercifully alone, allowed the composure she had maintained throughout the interminable carriage ride home to shatter like fine crystal dropped on marble, sinking onto the window seat, where moonlight painted silver patterns across her lap, while the tears she had forbidden herself for 3 years burned behind her eyes. Though even now, even in absolute privacy, she could not quite permit them to fall because crying felt like surrender, like admitting that Thomas Sinclair still possessed the power to wound her despite all her careful architecture of indifference. Seeing him today had torn open something she had convinced herself was healed, revealed the wound beneath the scar tissue as raw and aching as the night he announced his engagement, And worse somehow was Catherine's guileless warmth, her obvious confusion about Eleanor's withdrawal, because it would be so much simpler if Catherine were cruel or calculating. If Eleanor could hate her with clean, uncomplicated fury instead of this terrible tangled mess of love and resentment, and guilt for resenting someone whose only crime was being lovable, being chosen, being innocent of malice in her unwitting theft of Eleanor's entire future. The unfairness of Catherine's goodness felt like its own particular torture. The way she had reached for Eleanor's hands with such genuine affection, the hurt in her eyes at 3 years of unexplained silence, and Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and thought with bitter clarity that perhaps she was the villain in this story after all, punishing Catherine for the sin of being loved while Eleanor was not, withdrawing friendship as though it were Catherine's fault that Thomas's heart had chosen differently than Eleanor's desperate hoping had imagined. But beneath the resurrected pain of that old wound, confusing and unexpected, was another ache entirely. The memory of the Duke of Ashworth materializing at her side precisely when she needed him most, the solid warmth of his presence, and the protective way he had positioned himself between her and her past, and she found herself thinking about his steady courtship these past weeks, with a confusion that felt dangerously close to longing, remembering his revelation at the musicale about his own betrayal, the vulnerability in his voice when he spoke of being valued for his title rather than himself, and recognizing in that moment a mirror of her own wounded retreat from possibility. He had been hurt as she had been hurt, had built walls as she had built walls, yet somehow he had found the courage to pursue connection again, to risk himself despite knowing intimately the cost of misplaced trust, and that courage felt both admirable and terrifying, because Eleanor was not certain she possessed the same strength, was not certain she could survive being broken again when she had barely survived being broken the first time. Her heart felt like a battlefield where two fears waged war, the old fear of Thomas's rejection that had defined her for 3 years, fighting against this new fear of the Duke's persistence, this terror that he was awakening something in her carefully deadened chest that she had sworn never to feel again, and she sat in the moonlight of her chamber, understanding with painful clarity that she stood at a precipice, that the Duke's patient courtship was forcing a choice she had avoided making between the safety of her isolation and the terrifying vulnerability of allowing someone close enough to hurt her, between protecting her heart absolutely and daring to believe that not all love ended in devastation, and she did not know, could not know, which path led toward healing and which toward destruction, only that remaining frozen at this crossroads was becoming its own form of death, a slow suffocation of everything vital and alive that she had once been before. Thomas Sinclair taught her that love was something that happened to other people, to golden girls like Catherine, but never, ever to her. The charity art exhibition occupied the grand hall of the Royal Academy, with its soaring ceilings and northern light that fell across canvas and sculpture with impartial clarity, and Eleanor had accepted the Duke of Ashworth's invitation to attend with a mixture of reluctance and something she refused to name that felt dangerously close to anticipation, arriving in the late afternoon when autumn sun slanted golden through the tall windows and painted everything in tones of amber and shadow that matched her uncertain mood, as he appeared at her side with that quiet intensity she had come to recognize, offering his arm with simple courtesy that contained no presumption, no demand, only patient invitation. They moved through the galleries in companionable silence at first, pausing before landscapes and portraits, while other attendees drifted past in rustling silk and murmured commentary, and Eleanor found herself unexpectedly relaxed in his presence, the raw emotion of the previous night's solitary reckoning having somehow stripped away a layer of her defensive brittleness, leaving her tired but strangely unburdened as they examined a maritime scene where ships battled impossible seas, and the Duke remarked quietly that the artist understood something essential about surviving storms, about finding direction, when everything familiar had been torn away by forces beyond control. They rounded a corner into a smaller, more intimate gallery, and Eleanor stopped abruptly before a painting that seemed to arrest her breath, a work depicting a woman alone in a stone tower, her pale hand pressed against narrow window, while the world beyond bloomed with spring color she could observe but not touch. And Eleanor heard herself saying before she could reconsider the revelation, she has everything she needs within those walls, safety and shelter and protection from harm, yet she stands at the window watching life happen at a distance, and I cannot tell if her isolation is imprisonment or sanctuary, if those walls were built to keep danger out or to keep herself in where nothing can reach her, where she need never risk the world beyond that narrow window. The words hung between them, more honest than anything she had intended to share, exposing the architecture of her own careful exile in a way that made her cheeks warm with embarrassment. But when she glanced at the Duke, his dark eyes held only understanding, no judgment, no pity, only recognition of something he himself knew intimately, as he said with quiet intensity, "I think she believes it is sanctuary, convinces herself daily that her safety justifies her solitude, but in the darkest hours of night she knows it for the prison it truly is, knows that walls built high enough to keep out pain also keep out every possibility of joy, of connection, and of the very things that make existence more than mere survival." His words struck Eleanor like physical touch, like he had reached past every defense to name the truth she carried in her locked heart, and she found herself turning to face him fully, seeing him perhaps clearly for the first time, not as the persistent suitor who unsettled her careful equilibrium, but as another soul who understood the particular torture of self-imposed exile. And he continued speaking, his voice lower now, intimate despite their public surroundings. "I was engaged once, 5 years past, to a woman of exceptional beauty and accomplished manner, and I believed myself fortunate beyond measure until I overheard her conversation with her mother 3 days before our wedding. Heard her laughing about how tedious she found my company, but how she would endure it gladly, for the privilege of being a duchess, for the wealth and position my title would provide, and I understood in that moment that everything I had believed was connection, was performance, that she had never seen me at all, only the coronet I could place upon her head." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental realignment of understanding, as she recognized in his confession the mirror of her own wound, the way both of them had retreated from possibility after learning that what they offered, who they were beneath title and appearance, had been insufficient, had been overlooked or unwanted, and she found herself saying softly, almost involuntarily, "So you built walls too, withdrew from society where such deception could reach you, where you need never risk believing someone's regard again." And he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers as he replied, "Yes, I built walls of stone and silence, and I lived within them for years convinced I was protecting myself, until I saw you across a ballroom and recognized in your eyes the same loneliness that haunted my own reflection, and I understood that we were both slowly dying in our towers of safety, and I thought perhaps, if I were brave enough to risk emerging, you might find the courage to do the same." The revelation at the art exhibition shifted something fundamental between Eleanor and the Duke of Ashworth, a subtle realignment, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of their carefully maintained formality. And as autumn truly arrived in London with its golden leaves carpeting the parks and crisp air that carried the scent of wood smoke, and approaching winter, Eleanor found herself in the unexpected position of anticipating their encounters with something that felt dangerously close to eagerness, though she steadfastly refused to acknowledge this transformation even to herself, maintaining the fiction that her quickened pulse when she spotted his tall figure across a room was merely residual nervousness, rather than something infinitely more treacherous. 3 weeks after the exhibition, she had occasion to visit Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly in search of a volume her mother had requested. Entering the familiar sanctuary of leather bindings and paper scent on a Thursday afternoon, when the autumn sun slanted through the tall windows and painted the mahogany shelves in amber light, and she was examining a collection of poetry in the quieter recesses of the shop, when a familiar voice behind her remarked, with barely suppressed amusement, that he had not taken her for an admirer of Byron, and she turned to find the Duke standing closer than propriety strictly allowed, his dark eyes warm with something that made her breath catch as he reached past her to select a volume from the upper shelf with easy grace. Their conversation began with literature, but unfolded into something far more natural than their previous exchanges. The shared understanding from the exhibition, having dissolved some barrier that had kept their interactions confined to social pleasantry, and Eleanor discovered with surprise that the Duke possessed a dry wit she had not suspected, a talent for wry observation about contemporary poetry that made her laugh, actually laugh, a sound that surprised her so thoroughly she pressed her fingers to her lips as though to capture and examine this foreign expression of spontaneous joy. He went still at that laugh, his eyes darkening with satisfaction and something more intense, and he said quietly that he had wondered if she remembered how, if the woman who had laughed freely once might still exist beneath the armor she wore to every ballroom, and Eleanor felt simultaneously exposed and seen in a way that should have frightened her, but instead created a warmth in her chest that spread like spring thaw after long winter. They spent nearly an hour in that bookshop, ostensibly discussing literature but truly learning each other, discovering shared opinions on Shakespeare's sonnets and divergent views on the lake poets that sparked genuine debate rather than polite agreement. And Eleanor found herself noticing qualities she had kept herself deliberately blind to during his weeks of courtship. His genuine intelligence that engaged rather than condescended, his patience in listening to her arguments without interruption, the way his rare smile transformed his austere features into something almost beautiful, and the essential kindness that manifested in small gestures, like remembering her mother's request and helping Eleanor locate the specific volume she sought. When they finally parted on the street outside, his assistance in handing her into her carriage lingering a moment longer than necessary, Eleanor sat back against the cushions and felt the careful architecture of her resistance developing fissures, felt hope seeping through cracks she had sworn to keep sealed, and she told herself firmly that this meant nothing, that she was simply enjoying intelligent conversation with an acceptable acquaintance. But her heart, that traitor, knew better and beat with renewed life against her ribs. The note arrived at Eleanor's residence on a grey morning when November rain streaked the windows and made the world beyond seem distant and insubstantial. A simple correspondence on cream paper requesting her presence at Gunter's tea shop at 3 o'clock that afternoon, signed in Catherine's familiar, graceful hand, and Eleanor held the missive with trembling fingers while something long dormant stirred painfully in her chest, a mixture of dread and longing and grief for what had been lost 3 years prior, when friendship shattered on the rocks of unspoken love and inevitable betrayal. She arrived precisely at the appointed hour, her burgundy walking dress immaculate and her composure carefully maintained as she entered the establishment with its delicate scent of bergamot and pastry, its civilized murmur of genteel conversation, and found Catherine already seated at a corner table by the window where rain-softened light fell across her still beautiful features that time and contentment had somehow enhanced rather than diminished. And Eleanor felt the old complicated tangle of affection and resentment, admiration and envy, love and loss that Catherine's presence had always evoked since that devastating night of the engagement announcement. They exchanged greetings with painful formality, ordered tea neither truly wanted, and sat in awkward silence until Catherine finally spoke with characteristic directness, her voice quiet but steady as she said what Eleanor had never expected to hear, that she had always known, had understood from the beginning that Eleanor loved Thomas, had seen it in every glance and gesture and careful word during those golden summers when they had all been inseparable, had noticed the precise moment after the wedding when something essential had died behind Eleanor's eyes, and she had begun her transformation into the distant, untouchable woman she had become. Eleanor felt her careful composure fracturing, felt heat rising in her cheeks as Catherine continued with tears brightening her blue eyes, explaining that losing Eleanor's friendship had been a grief she carried daily, that she had written dozens of letters over the past 3 years that she had never sent, had reached out through mutual acquaintances only to be met with polite deflection, and that she understood she had no right to request forgiveness, but needed Eleanor to know that she had never acted with intent to wound, had never deliberately stolen what Eleanor wanted, had in fact fallen in love with Thomas during the 6 weeks when Eleanor had been visiting her aunt in Bath, a courtship that had unfolded in Eleanor's absence and reached understanding before her return. The explanation landed like both balm and blade, soothing the festering question of whether Catherine had known and acted with malice, yet reopening the wound with the reminder that life and love had simply continued without Eleanor, that her absence had created space for their attachment rather than prevented it, and she found herself asking with raw honesty why Catherine had never spoken of it, why she had allowed Eleanor to return, expecting everything unchanged when the world had fundamentally shifted, and Catherine's response came with quiet pain, that she had tried to tell Eleanor upon her return, but Thomas had requested silence until he could speak with Eleanor himself, and by the time he had found courage, the attachment was too deep to undo without devastating Catherine. And Eleanor had seemed so genuinely happy for them that Catherine had convinced herself perhaps she had been mistaken about Eleanor's feelings, perhaps had projected her own guilt onto innocent friendship. They sat in that tea shop for nearly 2 hours, while rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and their tea grew cold in delicate china cups, speaking with painful honesty about misunderstanding and missed communication, about the complexity of loving the same person and the impossibility of apportioning blame when hearts chose without consulting convenience or loyalty. And Eleanor felt something she had carried for 3 years, some calcified mass of anger and betrayal, beginning to crack and crumble as she recognized that Catherine's guilt matched her own grief, that both of them had lost something precious when their friendship dissolved, and that perhaps, it might be possible to forgive what had never been deliberately cruel, only painfully, inevitably human. Eleanor attended the Blackwell Ball that evening in a state she had not experienced in 3 years, her carefully constructed armor stripped away by the afternoon's emotional excavation with Catherine, leaving her feeling simultaneously lighter and more exposed, as though she had shed a protective carapace, only to discover how tender the skin beneath had remained. And she moved through the glittering assembly rooms at Blackwell House with her usual grace but without her usual imperviousness, aware that her eyes held something dangerously close to vulnerability, and her composure required actual effort rather than simply existing as her natural state. The Duke of Ashworth arrived unfashionably late, as had become his custom since he cared nothing for society's petty conventions, and Eleanor felt his presence before she saw him, that peculiar awareness that had developed between them during their months of careful approach and gradual understanding, and when their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, she saw his immediate shift from social courtesy to focused concern, saw him notice, with that unnerving perceptiveness he possessed, that something had altered in her expression, that the ice had fractured, even if it had not yet melted, and he moved through the crush of bodies with single-minded purpose, until he stood before her and requested the next dance with an intensity that had nothing to do with social ritual and everything to do with genuine concern for her well-being. They waltzed in unusual silence, his hand at her waist radiating warmth through the silk of her gown, and Eleanor felt herself trembling slightly with exhaustion from maintaining control throughout a day that had systematically dismantled beliefs she had held for 3 years, and when he quietly suggested they take air on the terrace, she found herself nodding agreement without her customary resistance, allowing him to guide her through the tall French doors and into the November night where autumn stars scattered across black velvet sky, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of approaching winter and wood smoke from distant chimneys. They stood at the stone balustrade overlooking the darkened garden below, and the Duke asked with simple directness what had happened to distress her. And Eleanor discovered in that moment that she was profoundly tired of carrying her history alone, tired of maintaining pretense, even with this man who had somehow seen through every careful facade she had constructed, and so she told him everything in a voice that shook occasionally but never broke completely, told him about Thomas and Catherine and the golden summers of her youth, about unspoken love and devastating betrayal, and the wedding that had shattered something essential in her soul, about 3 years of deliberate isolation and the afternoon's painful conversation that had begun the work of forgiveness. And he listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face with complete attention, and when she finally fell silent with the sense of having emptied herself of secrets she had sworn never to share, he did not offer platitudes or false comfort, but simply said that he understood now why she had fought so hard against connection, why she had built walls so high and made herself untouchable, that her response to such pain made perfect sense and took courage of its own kind, even if it was the courage of self-protection rather than vulnerability. And then he reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and took her hand in his larger one and held it with gentle firmness while the stars wheeled overhead, and Eleanor felt something shift fundamentally in her chest, felt the beginning of trust, of genuine intimacy, of hope she had thought forever extinguished, and realized with equal parts terror and exhilaration that she was falling in love with this patient, perceptive man who had refused to accept her performance and insisted on seeing the wounded woman beneath. The crisis arrived 3 days later at the Pemberton soiree, manifesting not through dramatic confrontation, but through carelessly spoken words that pierced Eleanor's fragile new openness with the precision of a surgical blade. For she had arrived early with her mother and found herself momentarily alone near the refreshment room when she heard Lady Ashford's distinctive nasal voice drifting through the partially open door, accompanied by Mrs. Cordelia Hampton's lower conspiratorial tone, and Eleanor had begun to move away, uninterested in whatever gossip occupied them, when she heard her own name spoken, followed by the Duke's, and she froze with her hand pressed against the cool silk of her gown, as Lady Ashford pronounced with malicious satisfaction that of course Ashworth was merely amusing himself with the Hartwell girl, that everyone knew he had wagered with Lord Pemberton that he could thaw the Ice Queen within 3 months, that men of his status entertained themselves with such pursuits when boredom overtook them, and Mrs. Hampton's response came with false sympathy, suggesting that poor Eleanor would be devastated when he inevitably abandoned the chase, that she had already suffered one romantic disappointment, and this would surely destroy what remained of her heart. And Eleanor stood paralyzed in the corridor as the words carved through every defense she had so carefully, so painfully begun to lower. As 3 years of protective instinct roared back to vicious life with the singular message that she had been correct all along, that vulnerability led only to devastation, that she had been a fool to trust, to hope, to believe that the Duke's attentions represented anything beyond aristocratic entertainment or masculine conquest. She moved through the remainder of the evening in a state of cold fury and deeper anguish, her face a perfect mask of indifference, while inside something essential, hardened back into the impenetrable ice it had been before Julian Blackwood had begun his patient siege, and when he arrived and approached her with that warm recognition in his dark eyes, that gentle concern that had seemed so genuine, she met him with arctic dismissal, informing him with cutting clarity that she would not dance with him this evening or any other, that his attentions were unwelcome and had always been so, that she wished him to cease his pursuit immediately, and she watched his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to genuine hurt, saw the exact moment when her words struck home and wounded him as deeply as the overheard gossip had wounded her, and some small part of her heart that had not yet refrozen cried out in protest at causing him pain. But she silenced it with ruthless efficiency and turned away, leaving the soiree early with the excuse of headache, her mother's worried gaze following her retreat. The carriage ride home passed in awful silence, Eleanor staring at darkness beyond the window, while her mind presented endless justification for her actions, reminding her that she had protected herself from inevitable abandonment. That discovery of his wager before deeper attachment formed represented fortunate timing rather than tragedy, yet beneath the rational arguments ran a current of desolation that intensified with each passing moment, and when she finally reached her bedroom and dismissed her maid, she discovered that sleep would not come and that she lay awake through endless dark hours, questioning whether Lady Ashford's gossip held truth or represented merely the malicious speculation of a woman known for cruel tongue and invented scandal, wondering if she had just destroyed something genuine out of fear and self-protection, whether she had repeated the very pattern that had kept her isolated for 3 years, choosing loneliness over the terrifying risk of possible happiness, and by dawn she felt hollowed out and uncertain, her confident cruelty of the previous evening transformed into sick regret and confusion about whether she had saved herself from heartbreak or created it with her own hands. The Duke of Ashworth did not appear at the Wetherby Musicale 2 evenings later, nor at the Fitzwilliam dinner the following night, nor at any of the subsequent gatherings that filled London's relentless social calendar during the week that followed Eleanor's cruel dismissal, and his absence created a void she felt with increasing acuteness as each event passed without his dark figure materializing in doorways, without his steady gaze finding hers across crowded rooms, without his deep voice requesting the honor of a dance she had come to anticipate, even as she pretended indifference. Eleanor attended these functions with her usual composure, her mask perfectly in place, yet she found herself searching for him despite her determination not to care, found her attention drifting toward entrances whenever new arrivals were announced, found herself listening for his name in conversations swirling around her, and the discovery that she missed him terrified her more than any vulnerability she had previously experienced, because it suggested that her heart had engaged far more deeply than she had permitted herself to acknowledge, that Julian Blackwood had succeeded in breaching defenses she had believed impenetrable, and his absence now created pain rather than the relief she had convinced herself she would feel. It was Beatrice who delivered the news that transformed Eleanor's vague unease into sharp panic, mentioning casually over breakfast on the 8th morning that Lady Pemberton had told her mother that the Duke of Ashworth was preparing to depart London for his country estate in Derbyshire, that he had been seen meeting with his steward and man of business, that the house on Grosvenor Square was being closed up for the season, and Eleanor felt something crack in her chest and felt control slip dangerously as she realized with awful clarity that he was leaving, that her cruelty had driven him away permanently, that she had destroyed something precious out of fear and self-protection, and the breakfast room suddenly felt suffocating, the walls pressing inward while her mother's concerned gaze rested heavily upon her face. That afternoon, when Eleanor could no longer maintain pretense even to herself, she found her mother in the morning room working on correspondence, and sat in uncharacteristic stillness until her mother set down her pen and waited with patient understanding for Eleanor to speak, and the words came haltingly at first, then faster, the entire story of Julian's courtship and her growing feelings, and the overheard gossip and her defensive cruelty, and his subsequent disappearance, and her discovery that his absence pained her more than she could bear, and her mother listened without interruption until Eleanor finally fell silent, exhausted and frightened and lost. Her mother's response came gently but with absolute clarity, pointing out with loving directness that Eleanor was repeating the pattern she had established 3 years earlier, choosing isolation over risk, running from possibility to avoid potential pain, building walls so high that nothing could reach her, neither hurt nor happiness, and she asked her daughter whether protecting her heart absolutely was truly worth the cost of never truly living, whether safety purchased through isolation represented victory or merely a different form of defeat, and Eleanor sat with those words settling like stones in her chest, while November rain began pattering against the windows, and her mother waited for understanding to dawn, and finally, painfully, Eleanor acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding, that she loved Julian Blackwood, that his steady presence these past months had become essential to her well-being, that life without him stretched ahead, empty and grey, regardless of how well protected her heart remained, and that if she did not act immediately, she would lose him not to betrayal or fickleness but to her own fear, and that would be a tragedy entirely of her own making. Eleanor made her decision in the grey afternoon light of that same November day, understanding with crystalline clarity that if she did not act immediately the Duke would be gone, and with him any possibility of the happiness she had glimpsed during their months of careful courtship, and so she did something entirely unprecedented for a woman of her station and careful propriety. She ordered the carriage prepared and dressed with deliberate care in a walking dress of deep blue wool, arranged for her maid Martha to accompany her as chaperone, and directed the driver to the Duke's residence on Grosvenor Square, while her heart hammered against her ribs with mingled terror and determination. The journey through London's busy streets felt interminable, yet also far too brief, leaving insufficient time to rehearse words that seemed to evaporate from her mind whenever she attempted to form coherent sentences. And when the carriage finally stopped before the elegant townhouse, with its black lacquered door and brass fixtures gleaming in the weak afternoon light, Eleanor nearly lost her courage entirely and ordered the driver to return home, but the memory of her mother's words steadied her resolve, and she descended with Martha following discreetly behind, approached the door, and knocked with a firmness she did not feel. The butler who answered regarded her with professional neutrality that barely masked his surprise at finding Miss Eleanor Hartwell on the doorstep, requesting an audience with His Grace, and for several awful moments Eleanor believed she would be turned away, that the Duke would refuse to see her after her public cruelty at the Pemberton soiree, but after the butler disappeared into the house's interior, he returned with the information that His Grace would receive her in the library, and Eleanor followed him through halls, already showing signs of closing Holland covers on furniture, paintings removed from walls, evidence that Julian truly intended to leave London and perhaps never return. The library where she was shown maintained its full warmth, a fire burning in the grate, and books still lining the walls floor to ceiling. And when the Duke entered through a side door, Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him. For though only 8 days had passed since their last encounter, he appeared altered, something shuttered and distant in his expression that had not been present even during their earliest meetings, and his greeting came with formal coldness that struck her like a physical blow. "Miss Hartwell," he said, not moving beyond the doorway, not offering her a seat, his dark eyes meeting hers with none of the warmth that had gradually developed over their months of acquaintance. "This is unexpected." Eleanor stood in the center of the room, feeling exposed and frightened and determined, aware that Martha waited in the hall and that propriety was barely maintained, and that everything depended on the words she somehow had to find. And she began with difficulty, her voice initially unsteady before strengthening as honesty compelled her forward, and she apologized for her cruelty at the soiree, explained about the overheard gossip and how old wounds had reopened, and fear had driven her response, admitted that she had built walls so high after Thomas's betrayal that she had nearly destroyed something genuine out of self-protection, and she confessed with halting vulnerability that his absence this past week had taught her a terrible lesson about what she stood to lose, and that she had discovered too late that she cared for him far more deeply than she had permitted herself to acknowledge, and that if he was truly leaving London, she needed him to know that his departure would leave a void in her life that safety and self-protection could never fill. Julian listened without moving, his expression unreadable, and when she finally fell silent, the room held awful stillness, broken only by the fire's crackling and Eleanor's labored breathing, and she watched his face for some sign of softening and found none. Saw instead the evidence of genuine hurt that her words at the soiree had inflicted, and understood that she had wounded him as deeply as she herself had been wounded 3 years earlier, and she realized with sick certainty that apology might not be sufficient, and that some damage once done could not be easily repaired. But then he moved finally, crossing the room to stand before her, and his voice, when he spoke, had lost some of its coldness, though pain remained evident in every word, and he asked her directly whether she truly meant what she said, or whether fear would drive her away again the next time gossip or doubt threatened, whether he could trust that she would not retreat behind her walls and leave him standing alone. And Eleanor met his gaze with every ounce of courage she possessed, and answered with simple truth that she could not promise never to be frightened, but she could promise to fight against the fear, to choose vulnerability over safety, to risk her heart because living without that risk meant not truly living at all. And she watched something shift in his expression. They saw the exact moment when his hurt began yielding to cautious hope, and he asked quietly what she wanted from him, and Eleanor answered with words that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. "I want another chance, Julian, if you can forgive my cowardice, and grant me one." Julian stood absolutely still for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his dark eyes searching Eleanor's face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as though every defense and every carefully constructed wall had become visible and penetrable. And then something profound shifted in his expression, the coldness melting like frost under spring sun, replaced by something raw and vulnerable that she had never seen him reveal before. And he spoke finally with a voice that trembled slightly, despite his evident attempt at control, and his words came not with the practiced eloquence of a duke accustomed to society's games, but with the halting honesty of a man who had himself been wounded and who understood precisely what her confession had cost her. "Eleanor," he said, her given name falling from his lips for the first time without formal address, "I must tell you something I had not intended to reveal, for I believed after your dismissal at the soiree that such confession would serve no purpose, save to humiliate myself further. But if we are to speak with complete honesty, then you deserve to know the truth of my intentions these past months. And the truth is this: I began courting you expecting nothing, drawn initially by something I recognized in your eyes during that first ball, something that matched my own carefully hidden loneliness, a kinship of souls who had both learned to armor themselves against further pain, and I thought perhaps we might achieve a comfortable arrangement, a marriage of mutual protection and understanding without the dangerous complications of deeper feeling." He moved closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the firelight reflecting in his eyes, could detect the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that always seemed to cling to him, and he continued with increasing emotion, his words coming faster, as though a dam had broken and could no longer contain what had been held back. "But watching you these months, Eleanor, speaking with you and dancing with you and glimpsing beneath your careful composure the passionate, intelligent, remarkable woman you work so diligently to conceal. I fell genuinely and completely in love with you, not with the ice-perfect society beauty you present to the world, but with the Eleanor who reveals herself in unguarded moments, who interprets paintings with fierce feeling and laughs with surprise at her own amusement, and who beneath all that protective armor possesses more courage and capacity for love than anyone I have ever known. And I do not want a convenient arrangement or a marriage of mutual isolation. I want a true partnership with a woman I love and admire beyond measure. I want you, Eleanor, exactly as you are, fears and walls and all, if you can find it within yourself to trust me with your heart, despite every reason you have learned not to trust. Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks unchecked, all pretense of composure abandoned, and the walls she had constructed so carefully over 3 years of self-protection crumbled entirely under the weight of his declaration, leaving her exposed and terrified, and somehow more alive than she had felt since that devastating evening when Thomas had announced his engagement to Catherine, and she found her voice finally, shaking but clear, and spoke words she had never imagined herself capable of uttering again. I love you, Julian, though I fought against it with every defense I possessed. Though I tried desperately to remain untouched and protected, you reached me anyway, and I want that partnership you describe. I want to build a life with you based not on careful distance but on genuine connection, and I am frightened beyond measure, but I choose this. I choose vulnerability and risk and the possibility of pain, because the alternative is the slow death of never truly living. He reached for her then, his hands framing her face with extraordinary gentleness, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and he looked at her with such tender intensity that Eleanor felt her breath catch, and when he kissed her finally, it was with a reverence that made the gesture feel less like mere physical contact and more like a sacred covenant, a mutual promise of protection and partnership and the courage to love despite past wounds. And Eleanor kissed him back with all the feeling she had suppressed for so long, pouring into that moment every hope and fear and desperate longing she had refused to acknowledge. And when they finally drew apart, both were trembling and transformed, the library around them holding witness to a breakthrough neither had been certain would occur. And Julian rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he would spend his life proving himself worthy of her trust, and Eleanor believed him absolutely and completely, and understood finally that choosing love after loss represented not weakness, but the most profound courage human beings could possess. The weeks following their reconciliation in Julian's library transformed Eleanor's experience of London society entirely, for their courtship now proceeded with an openness and genuine warmth that made every previous interaction seem like pale rehearsal, and she found herself anticipating balls and dinners, not as obligations to be endured, but as opportunities to see him, to speak with him, to experience the extraordinary sensation of being truly known and valued by another person. And when they attended the Haverford Ball in mid-December, the change in Eleanor was evident to everyone present, for she entered the ballroom not with her usual cool composure, but with unmistakable radiance, her ice-blue gown complementing eyes that now sparkled with life rather than defensive coldness. And when Julian approached to request the first waltz, she accepted with a smile of such genuine pleasure that the watching crowd murmured with satisfaction at this confirmation of what had become society's favorite romance. They danced as they had so many times before, but everything felt different now, transformed by honesty and mutual understanding, and Eleanor allowed herself to relax into his arms and to meet his gaze without guardedness, to feel the warmth of his hand at her waist and understand it as promise rather than threat. And Julian looked at her with such tender admiration that Eleanor felt her breath catch with the wonder of being loved so completely, and she understood finally what she had been missing during those 3 years of self-imposed isolation, understood that genuine connection required risk, but offered rewards that safety could never provide. The evening progressed with magical quality, each moment seeming somehow brighter and more vivid than ordinary experience, and during supper, Eleanor found herself part of a group that included several of Julian's friends, who welcomed her with warmth that felt inclusive rather than judgmental, and she discovered herself laughing naturally at Lord Ashton's witty observations and discussing literature with Lady Margaret, and feeling part of something rather than perpetually outside observing and Julian watched her gradual relaxation with visible satisfaction, his hand occasionally finding hers beneath the table in gestures of reassurance and affection that made Eleanor's heart swell with emotions she had thought permanently deadened. The encounter with Thomas and Catherine came during the interval before dancing resumed, an inevitable moment that Eleanor had both anticipated and dreaded. And when she saw them approaching across the ballroom, her first instinct remained the old protective retreat, but Julian's steady presence at her side anchored her courage, and she remained standing, as Catherine reached her with cautious hope visible in her expression, and Eleanor found herself able to greet them both with genuine warmth, rather than the cold politeness that had characterized their garden party encounter months earlier. And she saw immediately how this simple kindness affected Catherine, whose eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude, and Thomas smiled with an expression that combined continued guilt with evident pleasure at seeing Eleanor's transformation, and the four of them spoke briefly but without the terrible tension that had pervaded previous meetings, discussing inconsequential topics but doing so with real rather than performed friendliness. And when Catherine impulsively embraced Eleanor and whispered, "I have missed you so dreadfully," Eleanor found herself returning the embrace and responding, "And I you," with complete honesty, understanding that while their friendship could never be exactly what it had been before, something genuine could perhaps be rebuilt on new foundations of mutual understanding and forgiveness. The proposal came a fortnight later, in a setting of perfect privacy and intimacy, for Julian arranged to call upon Eleanor's family on an afternoon when winter sun temporarily broke through London's usual grey clouds, and he requested permission to walk with her in the garden despite the cold. And Eleanor's mother smiled knowingly and granted permission while insisting Martha accompany them at a discreet distance, and in the small walled garden behind the townhouse, with its dormant flower beds and bare tree branches, Julian took both her hands in his and spoke with simple eloquence about his desire to spend his life with her and to build a partnership based on honesty and mutual respect and the deep love they had found against all odds. And he asked if she would do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife, and Eleanor answered yes, with a voice that trembled with joy rather than fear, and she recognized in that moment of acceptance that she was choosing not merely marriage but life itself, choosing vulnerability over protection, hope over despair, love over the empty safety of emotional isolation. And when Julian kissed her there among the winter bare roses, she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her possibilities, felt herself becoming not the woman she had been before Thomas's betrayal, but someone entirely new, someone who had been broken and had chosen to heal. And their engagement was announced the following week to universal approval and celebration, society delighting in the romance of the reclusive Duke and the ice beauty who had thawed for him alone, though Eleanor and Julian understood that the truth was far more complex and far more precious than any story society might construct.